So imagine sitting in this completely sterile examination hall. You've spent the last 2 years of your life preparing for this exact moment, right?
Yeah, all that pressure just building up.
Exactly. You've cleared the biometric scanners, you found your seat, and you are just staring at this blank screen, waiting for the CUET-UG exam to load.
Yeah.
And then, well, nothing happens.
Just dead silence.
Right. 10 minutes pass, then an hour, then 2 hours. And that biometric system that logged you in, it's basically a digital cage now. Nobody in the room can tell you if your entire academic future just, evaporated because of some server glitch.
It's terrifying.
And
at the exact same time, thousands of miles away from that exam hall, a single foreign military vessel drops anchor in I think it's a 33-kilometer stretch of water in the Middle East.
oh, wow. Yeah.
And within hours of that happening, the price of the fuel you use to drive to that exam center and the price of the vegetables on your dinner table, they just skyrocket.
It really shatters that illusion, right? That illusion that governance is just this series of isolated spreadsheets or neatly boxed policies.
It absolutely does. Every decision, every technical failure, every border skirmish, it's all part of this massive living nervous system.
Which is exactly why we are here today. So welcome to the Daily Deep Dive. This is the 3D initiative of UPSC with Sarab Kaushik.
Glad to be diving into this stack today.
Yeah, and to you listening, the aspiring civil servant, maybe the future district magistrate or diplomat, our mission today is to tear through this really massive stack of 15 critical current affairs items. We're looking at May 31st and June 1st, 2026.
And we really aren't just reading headlines here. That's not the goal.
Right, no, we are taking the hood off these events to show you the actual wiring underneath. I mean, from technical collapses in India's education infrastructure to military escalations in Lebanon, we're going to connect these dots so you can see the landscape exactly how a policymaker must see it.
Because the overarching challenge for any administrator is dealing with unintended consequences. A policy that you implement in a vacuum, it's almost always going to fail in the real world.
Yeah, the friction between the plan and the reality.
Exactly. We have to look at the friction between what is planned and what actually happens when, human behavior, climate realities, and geopolitical rivalries enter the equation.
So let's actually start with that exact friction right back in that examination hall we just pictured. This is our first item.
The CET-UG glitch.
Right. Our sources are reporting this severe technical glitch on May 30th. It delayed the first shift of the CUET-UG 2026 exam by 2 full hours.
2 hours is an eternity in an exam setting.
It really is. So the National Testing Agency, the NTA, they did eventually get the system back online, and they reported that 95% of the students resumed and finished their tests. But, and here's the kicker, 3,765 candidates who had already done their biometric registration, they just left the centers early.
Which is a huge administrative headache.
Yeah, so now the NTA has ordered their tech partner, TCS-ION, to run a root cause analysis, and they announced a one-time retest for those specific students.
So we really need to analyze that 95% success rate here. I mean, if you're in a corporate IT environment, recovering 95% of your user base after a catastrophic server failure, you might actually celebrate that as a resilient response.
Right, like, hey, we saved most of the data.
Yeah, exactly. But in governance, especially here, it is a massive liability.
Yeah.
You're dealing with a high-stakes environment where a 5% failure rate translates to nearly 4,000 altered life trajectories.
Which is exactly why I look at the reliance on TCS-ION in here. The government is essentially outsourcing the technological backbone of its entire educational assessment. You've got millions of students relying on a system that is actively transitioning from legacy paper to this massive digital infrastructure. I mean, when that system buckles, who actually bears the ultimate administrative responsibility?
The state does.
Yeah.
Always. I mean, you can outsource the tech, but you can't outsource the accountability. The technological mechanism here is super complex. You have these local area networks at hundreds of testing centers.
Right.
And they need to securely sync with a central server.
To authenticate the biometrics, right.
Exactly. Authenticating encrypted biometric data in real time just to prevent impersonation. The moment there is a bottleneck in that data pipeline, the local machines just freeze up.
Yeah.
And the NTA's response, ordering a root cause analysis and a retest, that is an entirely reactive stance.
It totally feels like patching a hole in a ship after it's, already taken on water.
It is. And the critical takeaway for your administrative mindset for the listener preparing for General Studies Papers 2 and 3 is understanding contingency infrastructure.
Backup systems.
Right. Rapid digitization of a nationwide exam system without a proportionate pre-tested fallback system is just dangerous. A robust policy requires real-time monitoring dashboards that detect latency before a crash happens.
Not after people have been waiting for 2 hours.
Exactly. You need immediate offline contingencies that don't force students to just sit in an information vacuum.
Yeah. And, well, the friction of managing massive systems obviously doesn't stop at our digital infrastructure. I mean, some of our most complex administrative challenges happen where our domestic systems meet the outside world.
Physical borders.
Right, our physical borders.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our second item, a very deliberate piece of diplomatic choreography taking place in New Delhi. Myanmar's president, Umina Nonglang, arrived on May 31st for a 5-day visit.
And this visit, it brings a high-level delegation of ministers and business leaders to meet the prime minister.
Yeah.
But the itinerary itself is what reveals the real strategic depth here.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The official agenda is extremely heavy, right? Trade, connectivity, border security along our shared 1,640-kilometer border, countering insurgents.
All standard hard security topics.
But his very first stop upon landing wasn't a boardroom or a, defense ministry briefing. He went straight to the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya to offer prayers.
Which is classic statecraft.
Yeah.
Soft power is always the precursor to hard security negotiations. India operates on two converging diplomatic tracks here. You have the neighborhood first policy, which is about securing our immediate geographic perimeter. And then the Act East policy, which basically treats our eastern neighbors as a launch pad for deeper integration with Southeast Asia.
And Myanmar is kind of the absolute linchpin for both of those, aren't they?
They absolutely are. So by highlighting this shared Buddhist heritage at Bodh Gaya, you establish a cultural foundation before you ask for favors.
The cultural foundation is really just the wrapping paper, right? The actual box contains a massive security imperative. I mean, we have a highly porous border with Myanmar, and historically, it's been a total haven for insurgent groups operating in India's northeast.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Which is why the dialogue rapidly shifts to countering those exact insurgents. An administrator in India's border states cannot maintain internal security without the active cooperation of NAPIA.
Because they just slip back over the border.
Exactly. If Myanmar's military doesn't squeeze those insurgent camps on their side of the border, our internal security apparatus is constantly just playing defense.
And I have to bring up the regional hegemon in the room here. Every time we discuss connectivity with our eastern neighbors, China's shadow is just cast over the entire conversation.
China is the primary catalyst for India's infrastructure push in Myanmar, period. We're looking at frameworks like the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway.
Right.
The logic is brutally simple. If India doesn't provide viable trade routes, economic investments, and physical connectivity, China will fill that vacuum entirely. Myanmar acts as a security buffer. But if that buffer becomes entirely economically dependent on Beijing, India's strategic autonomy in the region is severely compromised.
So the goal is essentially to weave Myanmar into our economic fabric so tightly that it balances out that external influence.
That's the GS Paper 2 IR angle in a nutshell.
Perfect. So speaking of massive systems buckling under pressure, let's pivot from our international borders back to our domestic institutions. We just discussed the CUET-UG exam crashing. It turns out that was not an isolated incident in the education sector.
No, it really reveals a systemic pattern in how we are deploying digital governance right now.
Yeah. Item number 3, the numbers on the source are just staggering. For the 2026 Class 12 board exams, the CBSE rolled out a new on-screen marking, or OSM, system.
Yeah, the digital grading push.
Right. So they took approximately 98.7 lakh physical answer sheets, millions of them, scanned them into a database, and had roughly 70,000 examiners evaluate them on screens.
The objective being faster processing and higher transparency.
In theory. Instead, the pass percentage dropped to 85.2%, which is down over 3% from the previous year.
And a statistical drop like that immediately triggers scrutiny from everyone involved.
Oh, yeah. But the drop wasn't the actual crisis, right? It was the mechanism of the evaluation itself. Students basically revolted. They requested their scanned answer books and found answers completely unchecked by the examiners.
Just blank.
Yeah. Some scanned copies were blurred or entirely incomplete, leading to students seeing unexpected drops of 20 to 40 marks. And when nearly a quarter of all examinees, 25%, flooded the portal to request a reevaluation, the servers completely crashed under the weight of the demand.
So let's break down the mechanics of on-screen marking to understand why this failed, because this is prime GS paper 2 and 3 material.
Yeah, please.
The theory is that a digital workflow prevents physical tampering, right? And it allows an algorithm to ensure every question has a mark entered before the examiner can submit it.
Which sounds foolproof.
It does. But the system relies entirely on the quality of the initial physical scan, and crucially, the digital literacy of the examiner. If you have 70,000 examiners who have spent decades marking physical paper, and you suddenly mandate a transition to a digital interface without extensive, rigorous training,
You introduce massive human error into the digital pipeline.
Exactly.
I sort of view this like a massive digital highway. The CBSE built this multi-lane expressway to get these exams graded at lightning speed, but they completely neglected to build enough toll booths at the exit.
That's a great analogy.
Right, because the moment those students needed to access the grievance portal, the infrastructure bottlenecks cause a complete system collapse.
And it highlights a severe deficit in what we call digital trust. The short-term administrative fix is offering re-scrutiny, which CBSE is doing, but the long-term damage is profound.
It breaks the social contract a bit.
It absolutely does. When a governance system fails at an architectural level, where scanned copies are illegible and servers crash during grievance, redressal citizens lose faith in the digitization process itself.
Which is dangerous for a developing economy.
Very. You cannot treat the end user, whether that's an examiner or a student, as an afterthought in system design. Scalability must account for peak crisis load, not just optimal operating conditions.
Yeah, and it seems like all of our systems are operating at peak crisis load right now. I mean, our technology is crashing under unprecedented demand, and unfortunately, moving to item 4, so is our physical environment.
The climate data.
The climate data from late May is terrifying.
The pre-monsoon heat wave is pushing human habitability to its absolute limits across northern India.
We're looking at Delhi hovering consistently between 42 and 44 degrees Celsius. Banda in Uttar Pradesh hit a lethal 47.6 degrees.
That's just punishing heat.
It is. The India Meteorological Department is pointing to a stationary high-pressure ridge, an anticyclone trapping this hot air over northwestern India. Add to that the developing El Niño, which threatens to suppress our monsoon rains down to 90 to 92% of the long-period average.
The mechanics of an anticyclone are crucial to understand here, especially why this heat is so sustained and lethal.
See, I struggle to visualize this, because doesn't hot air naturally rise? How does a weather system act like a lid to trap heat at the surface?
Okay, so under normal low-pressure conditions, yes, warm air at the surface rises. It cools as it gains altitude, condenses into clouds, and eventually brings rain.
Right.
An anticyclone operates in reverse. It is a massive column of high atmospheric pressure where dense air is forced to sink downwards toward the Earth's surface.
Okay, so it's pushing down.
Yes, and as this air descends, it compresses. Basic physics dictates that compressing a gas increases its temperature. So you have this massive sinking dome of air that is actively heating up as it falls.
Oh, wow. And because it's sinking, it entirely prevents any moisture at the ground level from evaporating and rising to form clouds, right?
Precisely. You get perfectly clear skies. The solar radiation beats down uninterrupted onto the surface. Furthermore, our sources note the compounding effect of dry soils.
How does the soil affect the air temperature?
Well, if the ground is moist, a significant portion of solar energy is consumed in the process of evaporation, which naturally cools the ambient air. It's like sweat cooling the body.
Right.
But because the pre-monsoon was so dry, the soil is basically baked. So 100% of that solar energy goes into sensible heating, which means raising the temperature of the air itself.
And then you overlay this over a city like Delhi, with all the concrete and asphalt absorbing and re-radiating heat.
You create an urban heat island that refuses to cool down, even at night.
So for a policymaker studying GS1 and 3, this isn't just a weather report. It's a cascading administrative nightmare.
It stresses every single public system simultaneously. Agricultural yields plummet, which threatens food security and inflates prices. Hospital wards flood with heat stroke victims, stressing the medical infrastructure.
Power grids face collapse from air conditioning demand.
Exactly. And with El Niño threatening the upcoming monsoon, northern reservoirs are already failing to recharge. So the policy mandate here shifts from mere disaster response to aggressive climate adaptation.
Like mandating changes in labor hours.
Yes, redesigning urban canopies, rethinking water conservation at a municipal level. You have to adapt the city to the new climate reality.
Which brings us to item number 5. And it's a massive, glaring contradiction in our national policy.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. The heat wave demands immediate decarbonization. Yet the very next item on our docket is the government approving a 37,500 crore rupee scheme to essentially double down on coal.
It looks like total cognitive dissonance on paper. But it is actually a masterclass in the brutal pragmatism of energy security.
I really need you to explain this pragmatism to me and to the listener, because we have 47-degree heat waves fueled by global warming, and we are investing nearly $3.9 billion to gasify 75 million tons of coal annually by 2030. And the government is subsidizing 20% of the project costs. How does an administrator justify this in GS Paper 3?
You justify it by looking at the balance sheet of national survival. India sits on the world's 5th largest coal reserves.
Right, we have a lot of it.
But we are severely deficient in domestic natural gas. Consequently, we bleed foreign exchange importing liquefied natural gas, urea for our agricultural sector, and petrochemicals. So the policy here isn't about burning more coal in traditional thermal plants. It's about altering the chemical state of the coal we already have.
Ah, right. The process they are using is coal gasification. Mechanically, they subject the coal to intense heat and high pressure in the presence of steam and oxygen.
Exactly.
This breaks the molecular bonds of the coal without actually combusting it, producing syngas, which is a synthetic gas mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide.
And that syngas is the golden ticket here. It can be utilized to manufacture fertilizers, methanol, and petrochemicals entirely domestically.
Which cuts our reliance on imports.
Drastically. It insulates the Indian economy from the volatility of global energy markets.
But the carbon footprint doesn't just, vanish because we turned a solid into a gas.
It doesn't vanish, no,
Wait,
but
yeah.
it is significantly mitigated. The gasification process generates approximately half the carbon dioxide emissions of direct coal combustion.
Half is a big reduction.
It is. Furthermore, because the output is a concentrated gas stream, implementing carbon capture and storage technologies is chemically and logistically much more feasible than trying to scrub carbon out of the dispersed exhaust of a traditional smokestack.
So it is essentially a bridge technology. We leverage our dirty, abundant domestic resource in a slightly cleaner way to secure our agricultural supply chains, basically buying us time to scale up renewables.
That's the pragmatism. When you are managing a nation of 1.4 billion people, you cannot turn off the fossil fuel tap overnight without triggering mass starvation and economic collapse. Energy transition requires maintaining baseline stability.
And the fragility of that baseline stability becomes terrifyingly obvious when we look at our 6th item. We're talking about the international waterways where we buy our oil.
This takes us right to the Middle East, where geopolitics is actively dictating our domestic inflation rates.
We are looking at the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably the most critical energy choke point on the planet.
Without a doubt.
So, following a U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility back in February 2026, Iran has essentially militarized the strait. This waterway is only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, yet it facilitates the transit of 25% of all seaborne oil and 20% of global LNG.
And now Iranian Revolutionary Guards vessels are enforcing control, and tanker traffic has plummeted by an astonishing 90%.
90%. The economic shockwaves were instantaneous. Brent crude breached the $90 a barrel mark almost immediately. Maritime insurance premiums for vessels even daring to enter the Persian Gulf have become prohibitive.
It is the ultimate example of geography as a weapon.
Like a single stalled car blocking a major global artery.
Precisely. Iran doesn't have the naval tonnage to defeat a Western superpower in open combat, but they don't need to. By parking their fast attack craft in a 33-kilometer bottleneck, they are squeezing the global economy's jugular vein.
The mechanism of this leverage is profound for India, isn't it? I mean, we import roughly 85% of our crude oil requirements. And a huge portion of that flows directly through Hormuz. When that strait is constricted, our import bill inflates massively. That cost is passed down the supply chain to every factory, every transport fleet, and ultimately to the consumer buying groceries.
And the rupee depreciates as we demand more dollars to buy that expensive oil.
So if you're an Indian policymaker looking at this for GS2 or 3, how do you defend against a geographic reality you can't control?
Through diversification and redundancy. This crisis entirely validates the urgent necessity of expanding our strategic petroleum reserves to weather these supply shocks.
We need more physical buffer.
Yes. It also highlights why diplomatic initiatives like the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor are vital. We must find alternate logistical arteries, like rail networks and pipelines that bypass maritime choke points.
So we don't have all our eggs in one maritime basket.
Exactly, to ensure domestic growth isn't held hostage by regional conflicts halfway across the world.
Okay, so while our energy markets are held hostage by physical geography, our financial markets are being radically reshaped by pure technology. Let's shift to item 7, a massive structural change in global finance.
This involves the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. For context, this is a benchmark that dictates where hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment flow.
And the sources show a brutal recalibration here. India's weight in this index has collapsed from roughly 21% in September 2024 to about 11.9% by mid-2026.
It's a massive drain.
And the catalyst isn't that India's economy is shrinking, right? It's that we are entirely missing out on the global artificial intelligence and semiconductor rally.
Look at the nations consuming that lost weight. Taiwan's share has rocketed to 24.8%. And this is driven almost exclusively by one entity, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
Just one company.
Yeah. China holds 23% based on their massive tech conglomerates, and South Korea sits at 18.7%, driven by hardware giants like Samsung.
The contrast is just jarring. India has spent decades branding itself as the IT capital of the world, yet our heaviest hitters in the index, giants like HDFC Bank and Reliance, they barely register compared to a single semiconductor foundry in Taiwan. How did we miscalculate this so badly?
We didn't miscalculate exactly. We stalled on the value chain.
What do you mean?
Well, India's dominance was built on IT services, outsourcing, software support, and consultancy. We provide the human capital that maintains software systems. But the AI revolution isn't about software maintenance.
It's about the hardware.
Yes. It requires the physical fabrication of incredibly complex silicon chips and the creation of foundational large language models. TSMC actually manufactures the physical hardware that makes AI possible.
And because we don't build the hardware, passive capital is draining out of our markets. The data shows foreign portfolio investors pulled over $24.1 billion out of India in early 2026 alone.
The mechanics of passive capital flows are ruthless. Massive global index funds, they don't manually pick stocks. Their algorithms automatically allocate capital based on these index weightings.
So it's literally automated selling.
Exactly. When the MSCI algorithm dictates that Taiwan is more valuable because of AI hardware, billions of dollars automatically sell out of Indian equities and flow into Taipei. This systemic drain depreciates the rupee and tightens domestic liquidity.
That is a critical lesson for GS3 economy.
It is. A modern economy cannot rely indefinitely on service exports. You must build foundational technological sovereignty, or global capital will rout around you.
Wow. So we have global capital recategorizing India based on technology. But domestically, moving to item 8, we are fiercely debating how we categorize our own citizens and the massive resources tied to those identities.
This is the Adivasi delisting debate emerging from Jharkhand.
Right. And I want to emphasize that as we look at this, we need to look at it purely objectively through a constitutional lens. This is a very sensitive issue.
It's an incredibly sensitive constitutional intersection of identity, religion, and state resources.
Activists, and the sources say they are heavily supported by Sang-affiliated groups, are demanding a fundamental change to affirmative action. They want the scheduled tribe, or ST status, and its associated quotas stripped from tribals who have converted to Christianity or Islam.
And their core argument is that constitutional safeguards were explicitly designed to protect distinct indigenous cultural identities. They argue that converting to a major global religion fundamentally alters that social identity, rendering the protections obsolete.
Conversely, the opponents, including Sarna animists and Christian Adivasi, they view this demand as a targeted, discriminatory campaign. They highlight what they call a glaring inconsistency in the activists' logic.
Which is?
They note that tribals who assimilate into various Hindu sects are not subjected to this same scrutiny or threatened with the loss of their ST status.
To understand this for GS2 polity, we really have to look at the mechanical differences in how the Indian Constitution treats different marginalized groups.
Right. How does the law differentiate between a scheduled caste and a scheduled tribe regarding religion?
The legal architecture is distinct. For scheduled castes, historical disadvantage is intrinsically linked to the Hindu caste system. Therefore, the legal definitions for SC status have historically included religious parameters.
Religion actually matters for SC status.
Yes. However, Article 342 of the Constitution, which governs the notification of scheduled tribes, is entirely silent on religion.
It doesn't mention it at all.
No. The criteria focus on geographical isolation, distinctive culture, and socioeconomic backwardness. The courts have repeatedly affirmed that tribal identity is an ethnic and social marker, not strictly a religious one.
And this debate is accelerating right now because of the upcoming 2026 Jharkhand census. There is a massive push for tribals to register their religion as Sarna, a distinct indigenous faith, rather than Cheto the Hindu box,
which turns the census into a political battleground. For a policymaker, this scenario represents the deepest complexities of governance. You are balancing the fundamental right to religious freedom against the state's mandate to distribute limited affirmative action resources to structurally marginalized groups.
Because altering the criteria for ST status based on religious conversion would require massive constitutional amendments, right?
Exactly. And it would likely fracture social cohesion in highly sensitive regions. It demands a purely empirical, consultative approach, devoid of polarization.
Let's move from the survival of cultural identity to the literal survival of the state apparatus. Item 9. We return to the Middle East, diving into the mechanics of Iran's nuclear calculus.
The geopolitical landscape here shifted dramatically following that June 2025 Israeli airstrike on the Natanz facility.
Yeah, in the aftermath of that strike, the ceasefire negotiations hinge entirely on the state of Iran's uranium stockpile. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, reports show Iran still maintains roughly 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity.
And the percentages are everything here.
Right.
A standard civilian nuclear reactor generates power using uranium enriched to a very low grade, typically between 3 and 5%. To engineer a nuclear weapon, you need highly enriched uranium, sitting at roughly 90% purity.
So I think a lot of people, myself included, see 60% and think, well, they're still 30% away from a bomb. They have a long way to go. But the physics of enrichment don't operate on a linear scale, do they?
Not at all. The process of enriching uranium, separating the fissile U-235 isotopes from the heavier U-238 isotopes using gas centrifuges, it requires an immense amount of what physicists call separative work.
Okay.
The effort required to take raw natural uranium and enrich it to 60% constitutes the vast majority of the entire workload. Once you have a stockpile at 60%, the infrastructure and time required to spin it up to 90% is terrifyingly minimal.
I use the staircase analogy for this. Hauling the uranium from 0 to 60% is like carrying a massive boulder up an entire mountain. Getting from 60 to 90% is just stepping over a tiny fence at the summit.
That's a very accurate way to visualize it. The IAEA estimates that roughly 130 kilograms of 90% enriched uranium is sufficient for a viable nuclear device.
And they have 441 kilograms at 60%.
Exactly. Given that stockpile, their theoretical breakout time, the window required to produce weapons-grade material, is reduced to a matter of months.
So if the current negotiations collapse and Iran actually crosses that 90% threshold, what is the chain reaction?
The immediate consequence is a cascading arms race. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey will invariably view an Iranian bomb as an existential threat. This will prompt them to abandon their own non-proliferation commitments to secure their own deterrence.
And for the GS2 student studying international relations, how does this impact India?
For India, this is catastrophic. The entire Middle East, which is the primary source of our energy security, becomes a nuclear tinderbox. Furthermore, India's strategic investments, notably the Chabahar port in Iran, which grants us access to Central Asia bypassing Pakistan, would be paralyzed by the inevitable sanctions and conflict.
It is fascinating how nation-states rely on global bans and treaties to enforce security. But when we look at bans applied at a local level, the mechanics often backfire spectacularly. Which brings us to item 10, a prime example from Bihar.
This is a vital case study for GS2 polity and governance regarding the unintended consequences of social policy.
In April 2016, the Bihar government enacted a draconian ban on the sale and consumption of alcohol.
The prohibition policy.
Right. The stated objective was noble: curb the rampant domestic violence and financial ruin associated with widespread alcoholism. However, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does addiction. By eliminating illicit liquor, the state inadvertently engineered a massive surge in pharmaceutical narcotic abuse.
Specifically, the abuse of codeine-based cough syrups.
The seizure data is alarming here. In 2016, anti-drug agencies seized about 30,000 bottles of these illicit syrups. By 2024, that number exploded to over 1.17 lakh bottles annually.
Over 100,000 bottles.
Yeah. Just recently, in May 2026, a major Directorate of Revenue Intelligence bust intercepted a massive shipment of 7,500 bottles in Patna in a single raid. And hospitals are reporting a severe spike in overdoses linked directly to this pharmaceutical substitution.
Codeine is an opiate. It interacts with the central nervous system similarly to harder narcotics. When you abruptly remove a depressant like alcohol from a population with high addiction rates, the psychological and physical demand for intoxication doesn't just vanish.
The market simply reroutes to the path of least resistance. It's the classic whack-a-mole scenario in public policy. You strike down the liquor cartels, and an entirely new, potentially deadlier supply chain of pharmaceutical smugglers rises from the underground.
And it exposes massive vulnerabilities in parallel regulatory frameworks. These syrups are legally manufactured pharmaceuticals, meant for severe respiratory ailments.
Right, they aren't cooking this in a jungle somewhere.
No, they are made in factories. The fact that hundreds of thousands of bottles are being diverted into the black market highlights a catastrophic failure in tracking pharmaceutical distribution and enforcing prescription mandates.
So the administrative lesson seems to be that legislation is not a silver bullet for societal issues.
Legislation without infrastructure is just a declaration. If a state enacts a prohibition policy to improve public health, it must concurrently build the safety nets. Massive investments in de-addiction centers, psychiatric support, and rural healthcare infrastructure. Treating addiction purely as a criminal justice issue rather than a public health crisis inevitably breeds black markets.
Wow. Let's shift from fixing societal loopholes to fixing digital ones. Moving into our June 1st updates, item 11. We return to the CBSE on-screen marking debacle we discussed earlier.
Right, the system that collapsed under the weight of the 25% student grievance load.
The CBSE finally issued an official statement on May 30th. They announced that the vulnerabilities within their on-mark portal have been contained. But what's interesting is how they fixed it. They didn't just rely on their internal IT staff. They called in the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, CERTAIN, alongside experts from IIT.
The involvement of CERTAIN is a massive escalation in how we view educational tech.
Right, because CERTAIN is the national nodal agency for responding to severe computer security incidents. They're basically the digital special forces.
Exactly.
The sources indicate the system was migrated to a more secure infrastructure following unauthorized access reports back in March 2026.
Mechanically, what CERTAIN likely executed was a deep architectural review and penetration testing. They hunt for the vulnerabilities, unsecured API endpoints, poor encryption standards that allow the system to crash or be breached in the first place.
Bringing in the heavy hitters restores public confidence. But doesn't the fact that they needed CERTAIN to secure a high school grading portal highlight a massive flaw in how we procure and deploy government technology?
Absolutely. The fatal flaw is treating cybersecurity as an afterthought. You do not beta test massive digital infrastructure using the actual academic records of millions of students.
Right.
For GS2 and 3, a rigorous policy framework mandates independent third-party security audits and stress tests before any public deployment. The state's digital systems must be fortified by design, not patched in a panic after a breach occurs.
Yeah, domestic technical borders can be patched, but our physical borders with our neighbors require far more delicate maneuvering. Let's look at item 12, the diplomatic friction generated in Nepal.
This illustrates the immense fragility of regional diplomacy when it intersects with domestic politics.
On May 31st, Nepal's Prime Minister, Balendra Balan Shah, delivered his maiden address to the parliament. In a highly charged speech, he accused India of territorial encroachment, specifically referencing the Liput-Kalapani area. But he escalated the rhetoric by declaring, Nepal has encroached upon Indian territory as well.
It was an incredibly provocative statement. He further suggested resolving the cartographic dispute by convening historians and utilizing British colonial-era maps,
which set off international diplomatic landmines. The diplomatic blowback was instantaneous. Nepali opposition leaders demanded the remarks be struck from the record. Within hours, the Nepal Foreign Ministry was in full damage control, issuing a clarification that the Prime Minister was merely referring to the informal, cross-border movement of local villagers in no man's land, not making a formal admission of official territorial violation.
This is the peril of megaphone diplomacy. The Liput-Kalapani region is a deeply sensitive strategic watershed. The dispute centers on the source of the Mahakali River, which defines the border under the 1816 Treaty of Sugali. Tensions flared significantly in 2019 when both nations updated their political maps.
When a newly elected leader like Prime Minister Shah invokes British colonial maps to resolve the issue, what is the strategic play there?
It is a calculated attempt to internationalize a bilateral dispute. By referencing third-party historical documentation, a smaller state attempts to draw outside attention to level the playing field against a larger neighbor. India's foundational diplomatic stance is that all border disputes must be resolved strictly bilaterally.
So when a leader uses an international border dispute to score domestic nationalist points, they risk detonating the broader strategic relationship.
Exactly. For an Indian diplomat studying GS2, the objective is to prevent the rhetoric from dictating the policy. You acknowledge the clarification, you maintain the established mechanisms for border dialogue, and you rely on quiet, institutional engagement to prevent a public speech from derailing the neighborhood first agenda.
Okay, so while international cartographic borders define the outer limits of a nation, the cultural borders defined in a classroom often dictate the internal cohesion of a state. Which brings us to item 13, a massive legal battle over the three-language formula.
This is where sweeping national education policy collides head-on with fundamental constitutional rights.
On June 1st, the Supreme Court commenced hearings on a batch of petitions challenging a controversial CBSE mandate. This mandate requires Class 9 students to learn 2 Indian languages, effectively moving foreign languages like French or German out of the core curriculum and into an optional, non-graded slot.
And the government's defense is rooted in the National Education Policy, the NEP 2020. The fundamental logic of the NEP is to decolonize the curriculum and deeply embed Indian cultural heritage and linguistic diversity into the educational foundation of the youth.
But the petitions argue this crosses the line from promotion into coercion. Critics argue that education should foster global mobility and student choice. By mandating 2 indigenous languages, they argue the state is engineering cultural conformity and potentially violating the educational rights of minorities to establish and administer their own curriculum.
We really have to evaluate the logistical reality of this policy, entirely separate from the ideological debate.
Let's talk about the logistics, because the mandate is scheduled for nationwide rollout by July 2026. Even if the policy is perfect in theory, do we have the sheer number of teachers required to teach multiple Indian languages nationwide by next month?
You cannot. That is the administrative bottleneck. If a school in Tamil Nadu or Kerala is suddenly legally mandated to hire thousands of proficient certified teachers in Hindi, Sanskrit, or another Indian language by next month, the system will break. There is no existing pipeline producing that volume of educators.
So you end up hiring underqualified staff just to meet a compliance checkbox, which ironically degrades the quality of the education you were actually trying to improve?
Exactly. Sweeping national mandates often fail to account for localized resource constraints. The Supreme Court's intervention here is critical for GS2 polity and education. They are tasked with balancing the state's vision for cultural integration against the practical realities of implementation.
They might have to modify it.
The court may mandate a staggered timeline or introduce flexible opt-out clauses to prevent an administrative collapse.
The fact that the Supreme Court is actively mediating a school curriculum dispute leads perfectly into item 14. We are seeing an incredible expansion of the judiciary's footprint in daily governance.
The debate over judicial activism versus judicial overreach. This is a central theme in Indian polity.
Our sources highlight the growing trend of the Supreme Court utilizing suo motu cognizance. For context for you listening, suo motu means the court initiates a hearing on its own accord, based on media reports or public interest, without waiting for a formal petition to be filed. Recently, the Apex Court took suo motu cognizance of the Twisha Sharma dowry death case, bypassing the lower courts to order high-level judicial oversight.
And the immediate instinct is to view this as a victory for justice. In sensational high-profile cases where local law enforcement may be compromised or sluggish, the Supreme Court stepping in ensures transparency and immediate action.
But the legal community is raising a massive red flag. They point out that in several recent cases, like the Hathras incident in 2020 or the Lakhimpur Kheri violence, the Apex Court intervened even when the trial courts were actively functioning. The commentary describes this as the Supreme Court ringing its own chain.
The metaphor implies an emergency stop to the normal judicial machinery.
Right. So, if the highest court in the land steps in to guarantee justice in high-profile cases, doesn't it inadvertently signal that the lower courts aren't capable, essentially acting as the first responder rather than the final arbiter?
That is the core of the critique. The constitutional architecture is hierarchical for a reason. The Supreme Court is designed to be the final arbiter of complex constitutional law, not a super police force managing daily criminal investigations.
Right.
When the apex court habitually exercises suo motu powers, it inadvertently broadcasts a lack of faith in the district and sessions courts.
And it creates a skewed system of justice. The court's bandwidth is finite. If they're dedicating massive resources to a few highly publicized cases, thousands of ordinary citizens languish in a backlog system.
For the aspiring administrator studying GS2, this trend highlights a failure of systemic reform. Top-down judicial intervention is a symptom of a diseased lower system. Instead of relying on the Supreme Court to rescue high-profile cases, the state must undertake the agonizing, unglamorous work of ground-level reform.
Like what, specifically?
Absolute overhauls in forensic evidence collection protocols, robust witness protection frameworks, and massive capacity building for lower court judges to clear the backlog.
Okay. We conclude today's deep dive by moving from domestic judicial interventions to a massive military intervention abroad. Item 15. We return to the Middle East for a major escalation.
The conflict is spilling over.
On June 1, 2026, the Israeli forces executed their deepest ground offensive into Lebanese territory in 26 years, advancing roughly 5 kilometers deep. They captured Beaufort Castle near Nabatea. Prime Minister Netanyahu claims approximately 3,000 Hezbollah militants were killed, though those figures remain unverified. This is the highest escalation since the Gaza war spillover.
The geographic target, Beaufort Castle, carries immense historical and tactical weight. It is a massive Crusader fortress built nearly a millennium ago. Israel occupied this exact stronghold during its protracted occupation of southern Lebanon from 1982 until 2000.
It is chilling to think about mechanized infantry units bleeding over the exact same stones that Crusaders fought over centuries ago. It proves that tactical high ground never loses its value. But how does this specific advance alter the modern geopolitical map?
It signifies the transition from a contained conflict to a regional proxy war. Hezbollah is not a standard militia. It is a highly sophisticated, heavily armed proxy of the Iranian state. They possess deeply entrenched subterranean infrastructure and advanced missile capabilities in southern Lebanon.
So they aren't just fighting a small group.
No. By launching a deep ground incursion to secure a buffer zone, Israel is directly engaging Iran's primary deterrent force in the Levant.
And crucially for the UPSC listener, why is an Indian civil servant closely monitoring a fortress in Lebanon?
Because the shockwaves hit our sores immediately. Firstly, there is a massive Indian diaspora embedded across the Middle East whose physical safety is paramount.
Right, evacuations might be necessary.
Exactly. Secondly, a direct war between Israel and an Iranian proxy threatens to drag Tehran directly into the conflict. And that brings us full circle to our earlier discussion on the Strait of Hormuz.
If Iran enters a full-scale regional war, the first thing they will do is seal the strait, cutting off 25% of the world's oil and immediately paralyzing India's energy imports.
Precisely. The globe is a single pressurized system. The artillery fired in Lebanon today dictates the cost of manufacturing in Maharashtra tomorrow.
Wow. We have dissected an unbelievable amount of information today. I mean, from the crumbling digital infrastructure of the CUET exams to the crushing anti-cyclones over Delhi. We've navigated the diplomatic tightropes with Myanmar and Nepal, analyzed the brutal calculus of coal gasification, and mapped the volatile frontiers in Lebanon and the Strait of Hormuz.
And what should be abundantly clear to you listening is that isolation is an illusion. You cannot draft an education policy without considering cybersecurity. You cannot manage energy imports without understanding Middle Eastern proxy warfare.
It's all connected.
It is. The hallmark of a formidable administrator is the ability to anticipate the second and third order effects of these intersections. You will rarely deal with an issue in a vacuum. A decision on education policy might end up in the Supreme Court, and a conflict in the Middle East will absolutely impact your local energy budgets.
The interconnected system under stress. Before we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Today we saw how a liquor ban in Bihar inadvertently fueled a cough syrup crisis, and how a global AI boom quietly drained capital from India's stock market. As you study these policies, ask yourself, how do we design policies not just for the problems we see today, but for the invisible, unintended consequences they will inevitably create tomorrow?
That is the ultimate question of governance.
Thank you for joining this daily deep dive session. Keep connecting the dots in your preparation.